Guys, today's review is something kind of special. First off, we're talking about a very special film by a very special filmmaker. Ari Aster's new movie Midsommar is a wonderful follow-up to his feature film debut Hereditary. And if that movie made you uncomfortable, sad, and irretrievably downtrodden, well, the good news is this film does all of that as well. Unfortunately, this movie only played at a few theaters here in town and not our normal theaters, but that's a story for later. So I'm excited to get into this, but before we do, to get into the right headspace for Midsommar, we gotta go deep. We gotta go really deep. Because I'm still bummed out and probably need some therapy.
I don't know what to say.
Now, when I say that I'm bummed out, it's definitely a compliment. Ari Aster has a way of making the audience feel things in ways that many filmmakers don't. Lars von Trier is a great example of this. He's able to convey a message and a narrative in a way where you care about the characters, and when he's really trying to impact you with something, especially in the genre of horror, he has a masterful way of doing it without necessarily resorting to cheap scares, cheap tricks, and gore. Much like with Inglourious Basterds, where the first sequence is basically a short film, Midsommar's is entirely self-contained in much the same way. And when I say that, I mean it is so beautiful in its own way, and it does such a good job of propelling you into the world and the mindset and the emotion of its characters that you really can find no fault with it. And a lot of that goes into the acting. Obviously, we can't talk about the acting and how heartfelt that sequence was without getting into how great the performance is by Florence Pugh, whose name I'm sure I'm getting wrong and I'll hear about in the comments here shortly. Her performance in the first 10 to 15 minutes is something that is truly remarkable. And it's remarkable not just because of her presence, but sometimes her lack of presence. Sometimes the way that her voice and her tone plays in with the visuals that you're seeing, and a lot of that comes back to, like we've talked about before, the willingness of a director who is so keenly aware of his vision that he can give that actor or actress space to really come through with full tonality of their emotions. And this is a masterclass example of how to do that. All of this is to set up the fact that Midsommar is a movie about a woman played by Florence Pugh who experiences a great personal tragedy, let's just say in a spoiler-free way, and works her way into a trip with her boyfriend Christian and his friends from postgraduate school to go to Sweden to join a friend of theirs at what is basically a reunion of his commune, his family's commune, that has sort of this pagan society and pagan rituals that they want to experience, not just for the Wunderlust, but also because it may or may not relate to their PhD studies. And it's a very interesting setup, especially because you enter the film with just enough information by the little bit of dialogue in the preamble before the credits that you get a little bit of characterization for everybody, especially Christian and his girlfriend, the star of the show, Danny. And the crux of the entire setup is that Danny, because of her personal crisis, is completely isolated and alone and obsessed with her trauma and her tragedy. And her working her way into this trip is an expression of wanting to be accepted by the group, wanting to be taken care of, wanting to be part of something given what she's lost. And it's a wonderful setup to a movie that really deals with isolation and finding yourself as the audience transported into this commune that for 2.5 hours is your family, for better and for much worse. And what's great about this movie is there are moments where, again, the film pulls back and just lets you experience the emotions of your protagonist. It doesn't necessarily overwhelm you or beat you over the head with it, and I think a lot of people might complain that Danny can be monotonous sometimes with her PTSD, with her anxiety attacks and panic attacks. I don't think it got to that point. I think it was just at that line where the character expresses such a discomfort and a complete isolation from her environment that you really do empathize. And part of the movie is really about tolerance, and part of it, which we'll get to later, is about acceptance. And so what Midsommar does so well is it injects you straight into this other way of living. There's really not a lot of communication. Cell phones don't work out here. There's really no internet. These are just people experiencing, I guess you could say, a tribe of individuals who really live in their own world. And the world building in that sense is beautiful, from the architecture to the set design to the wardrobe to the way the characters hold themselves. It really does create a separate world. This is now a prop that's becoming inconvenient. And so a lot of what you're dealing with is this constant tension that I think is very natural. Not just because you know you're walking into what's being advertised as a horror film, but because just like Danny and Christian and the rest of these college kids, postgraduate kids, you are uncomfortable in a new place with new people. And experiencing all these things, not knowing what to say or do, not knowing the rituals, and occasionally having a language barrier is just a disconcerting feeling. And this is sort of the foundation upon which the film really builds its tension. There's a long runtime in this. It's about 2.5 hours, but the film doesn't seem to drag, and it's constantly feeling tense or ominous, and at the end it feels like a proper descent on a roller coaster. In fact, it feels more operatic. And what this really allows for is to have a dynamic series of emotions and thoughts and feelings, and to experience the progression of fear, not from the paranoia that you're experiencing to the paranoia that these characters are probably feeling, to the moment where things are getting a bit too real. And what that sequence at least said to me, or what the first act says to me is, I know that if I were in this situation, I would nod my head and go, cool, that's your ritual, that's your practice, that's how you do things, that's great. And I'd go back to my friends and I'd be like, they're listening, don't act terrified, we need to get the fuck out of here. But it does raise the question of, at what point in someone's rituals do you step back and go, this is not acceptable from what I'm used to? And so what the film does is it kind of gives you steps and tiers of violent and inappropriate behavior where you don't immediately go, well, why would anybody stay there? Why would they go to Crystal Lake when they know Jason just killed 10 people? You kind of sit there and go, well, they're not really sure what the norms are. They're trying to be tolerant. These are people who, for a living, study different cultures, and they know that things can get a little weird in communes like this, and perhaps it's not really for us to say what's right or wrong. This, of course, completely changes as the main characters themselves become involved in some of the rituals. And that's about where I want to stop with the spoiler-free review when it comes to the plot. Fundamentally, this movie, there are violent moments, there are moments of horror, but really what it is it is a slow-burning thriller, and one that never lets you feel comfortable. While there are moments of comedy, they're really moments of absurdity. And this, to me, is what makes Midsommar masterful from a directorial standpoint. It's the ability to create this world, to create doubt and fear and danger, while you empathize with the characters and, for a while, the decisions that they're making, until you realize they've reached a point of no return and you no longer question whether or not they should be doing things differently. You, much like them, realize they're kind of stuck here and they're gonna ride this roller coaster out, so I guess I am too. Of course, none of this tension really means anything without characters we can empathize with, root for, or understand the cause and stakes of their potential demise. Part of that is directing, part of that is writing, and a lot of that is the acting. William Jackson Harper, I think, is fantastic, and Will Poulter are really actors who I think ground these human beings into these characters and make you empathize with the downward spiral that they are embarking on. And William Jackson Harper, I think, plays one of the few people that really most felt like a human being. Florence Pugh is obviously wrapped up in her personal tragedy, so she's dealing with a lot of that all throughout and doesn't give her necessarily a lot of range till closer to the end. And Will Poulter's kind of similar. He's sort of playing the comedic side character, but he also does seem like just a real bro who's just trying to go out to Sweden, experience new things, and possibly get laid. But they all play those roles with a lot of commitment. And if I had to use one word to describe this film, it would be genuine. Similarly, one of the things that I cannot praise this film for enough are the visuals and the aesthetics. You get a lot of outdoor sequences, a lot of interesting colors, but also some really interesting visuals that stem from when these characters ingest hallucinogenic mushrooms and other liquids that are laced with chemicals. Whenever these characters are inebriated in some sense, you get really authentic, not that I would know, LSD-type visuals, mushroom-type visuals, where everything in the foreground that you're trying to focus on looks normal, and it's not disorienting or distracting, but in the background, trees are breathing, bushes are kind of morphing into each other. Just a little subtle touch that reminds you, yes, this is not normal. Yes, what you're seeing is literally true in front of you, but you're definitely not seeing it through an objective narrator or an objective observer. The film is such an interesting combination of a power dynamics in a relationship story, but also such an interesting, dark, Nordic, fairy tale. And it's a film that opens up with this beautiful tapestry and has all these visuals all throughout, of when they get to this commune, seeing these paintings and illustrations of how these rituals are performed.
What's that scar on the wall for?
Where it really does feel like a really dark and fucked up Grimm's fairy tale. One where at the end, again, it works best as a metaphor more than it does as a literal story. And that's something that not a lot of directors have the patience to pull off. And I think that's really the mastery and the artistry of this film. I've talked to a lot of people who think it's a horrible movie and it's too long and it's not scary enough and it's not gory enough. And then I've talked to people who think that it's a masterpiece and it's gorgeous and it's brilliant and poetic. And I think the reality lies somewhere in between there. I can honestly say that after 2.5 hours, I was at no point bored. I didn't really think anything in the movie was bad. But the biggest thing I would criticize is that some of the characters felt like they were kind of throwaway, like they were there to kind of fill space. I felt like occasionally I didn't quite understand the MO of the people running this commune. At sometimes when things happen, they'll explain to the visitors, hey, I didn't know that you weren't abreast of what was going to happen here. I thought you were up to speed. It's so beautiful. This is part of our religion, et cetera, et cetera. And then at other times, it's an obvious attempt at obfuscation. And since they have them all kind of captive anyway after the first 45 minutes, I didn't really get why there was such a push and pull. But that leaves us with a very simple question. Who would like it? Who wouldn't? And I'm going to start referring to movies that are more gory and traditional horror that we're used to, like Saw or Friday the 13th, as Josh films. My friend Josh, I love him dearly. He loves those kinds of movies. If it's got a lot of gore, that's a huge bump for him. That'll take him to a 4 out of 5. There are moments in this that are incredibly gory, that are incredibly uncomfortable, but that's not the point of this movie. And so for someone like that, I don't know if I'd suggest he sit through 2.5 hours of it. Now, if I'm looking at a Joe, for instance, who is willing to sit through 3 hours of David Lynch for 1 or 2 amazing sequences, yeah, this is a movie right up your alley. It's a movie that I don't know if I'd say you like it or that you wouldn't like it, but I definitely think it's something that you have to experience. I know that I don't love it. It's not my favorite movie ever, but I'm super glad that I experienced it. And all the little details, from color theory to subtle connections between the tapestries that I mentioned earlier with these rituals that go on in cartoon form and how they're playing out before you in real life very subtly, it's definitely a movie laden with Easter eggs. So for me, it's the kind of horror movie that I love to see. It's like a new genre. It's one where the horror is very human. It's one where horror is really character-driven, and it's, in many ways, very real. And that's a horrifying thing from start to finish. That said, at the end of the day, if a strange friend of yours decides to take you across the entire world to go to a strange pagan ritual, as occurred to one of the female characters named Connie, you should really ask a couple questions, like what the hell exactly is going to happen?
Hey, how do I know, Connie?
Hopefully that was pretty straightforward, I gotta tell you. It's a movie that I walked out of feeling depressed and downtrodden, but that's a good thing. It means that the director definitely accomplished what they wanted to, and they left an emotional impact on me, the viewer. And that's a very hard thing to do, and that's definitely to be appreciated. So if you want to see it, if it sounds interesting, what are you waiting for? It's July. It's only midsummer for a couple more weeks. It's going to get to be late summer, end of summer, 500 days of summer.